Hey everyone, FPL Fran here with another video. I'm planning to get out a Game Week 10 draft wildcard. As I've known that a lot of people have actually suggested that they're actually on the wildcard and wanted to almost have a bit of pointers in terms of which direction to go for and what kind of draft that I would go with for this week. So I've spent some time to almost look back at what the template is, what the team that I think I'd build going forwards to attack Game Week 10 is, whilst also taking into account that of course, if you've delayed the wild card up until this point, you've probably not been able to maximize the most in terms of team value. So we've cut down in terms of options, thinking about that in mind, right? I'm not using my team value, for example, for the purpose of this wild card. If you've been able to capture a lot of price rises, that's fantastic. I think I'll suggest a couple in the video where you can actually look towards making upgrades from this team. But let's just start from a Game Week 10 perspective. Let's think about the fixtures that we're trying to attack. And I think one thing to mention, if people want almost a second or a third opinion on a wild card, feel free to have a look at the link in the description below. The Fantasy Football Hub, my AI team rating tool, actually has its own suggested wild card for Game Week 10. You can have a look at how that compares. See, for example, what is that sort of 100% rated draft. Compare that to yourself, compare that to this draft, and see what you like about it, what you might not like about it. At the same time, you can even plug in your own chip strategy and have suggested transfers on the wild card. So you can actually think about what your future transfers are coming out of this wild card might be, depending on how you set it up. So let's just jump into the video. And I think the easiest way to almost look at how I would build up a wild card is to think about the team landscape as well from a fixture point of view. And then of course we have a general understanding of our picks, which is very much illustrated and illuminated by the cheat sheet series that I've actually done. If you want to have a look at the cheat sheet this week, it's already been posted, it's already been published. So feel free to have a look at the cheat sheet as well for a little bit of guidance in terms of how I view the transfers and how I view a lot of the picks, because some of the picks might not appear here, but I think they're still very much valid within the FPL landscape. So without further ado, let's have a look at 11fi.com's team model and his predictions for the next 6 weeks ahead. So I think when I look at goals and teams to target, I don't think there's a surprise that Liverpool and City are still on top. I think if there's anything we can give credit towards Liverpool for this season is that they can still score goals. It's just the defense that has fallen off. And even to an extent, let's say, the ability for the midfield to not get constantly run over or played through, that's gone. I think City, similar sort of conditions there, right? Where within the right circumstances, they can score plenty of goals, but then there's still going to be opportunities like, for example, the Aston Villa game where you can see City be completely stifled. Whereas with Arsenal, I think clearly they've just maximized their ability to sort of reduce the amount of goals conceded, and they're still creating enough chances through set piece and open play to actually be a top attacking team. Not too far behind, though, and I think the most impressive story this season is Crystal Palace, where they truly have a great fixture on now. They've already built up fantastic underlying stats, and I think another team in that sort of same vein would be United, where the fixture run's actually pretty clean. Same goes for Brighton too, just given that they have really good home games. These are teams that I think are relatively underpriced in terms of how you can actually find an avenue towards some of their players, and how I would actually attack, let's say, going for a draft right now. As far as Newcastle, they're probably another team to target, but I actually think the fixture run actually doesn't really start after Game Week 10. Like, Game Week 10 is a great game. It's a game versus West Ham, which we know is a wonderful team to target, but it actually is a pretty dull run up until Game Week 14-ish for Newcastle. So I'm not sure if they're really a team that I target just from a price point perspective. And then for Chelsea, because they actually have such good short-term games, I would almost view Chelsea as a team where you maximize the three fixtures, especially around 11 and 12, and then you move off of a team like Chelsea and potentially into even, let's say, a team like City here, where from the midfield, I'd probably eye up someone like a Phil Foden if he continues to get really, really good minutes. For clean sheets, clearly Arsenal are top. Do you need to triple up on Arsenal? I don't think so necessarily. I still think Saka is very interesting, especially since he actually competes quite well with captaincy sort of alternations between him and Haaland. And at the same time, if you want that double game week later down the line for Arsenal, if that is to, for example, arise, I kind of like having Saka there too, not just, for example, a triple Arsenal around that time. However, pretty high up on cheat sheets, no shock is a team like Chelsea. Palace are up there as well. Bournemouth as well, Brighton as well, for the sort of price points that they're at. I think the key thing when you're looking at clean sheets like this is not necessarily what the flat raw numbers are, but actually in terms of the average price of the defenders, what is the value? So you can see a huge gap between City and Liverpool and Arsenal. So that doesn't necessarily mean that City and Liverpool should be teams that you target. It's actually just reflecting here, I think, how strong Arsenal is. And then maybe, of course, how close City and Liverpool are to, for example, a team like Newcastle. or even to an extent, for example, even Everton with Michael Keane being available, or some of the Crystal Palace or Bournemouth defenders who are even cheaper. So from that perspective, let's actually quickly build up our draft. The draft that I'm suggesting, as I said, is specifically created with the intention to reduce as much of the sort of sale value as possible. So I'm almost pricing in that you would have a much worse transfer or team value, given that you've actually waited and delayed for the wild card, which is just completely normal. If you have a little bit more money, of course, feel free to make the upgrades. But yeah, that's going to be the sort of overriding logic here. I would go with Petrovic and Dubravka as my goalkeepers. Now, you start with a really, really poor fixture here for both goalkeepers. It's Petrovic versus City, and it's Dubravka versus Arsenal. Now, I would definitely just play Petrovic versus City, even though Dubravka is the player with at home, just simply because I think I rate the Bournemouth defense a lot more. But if you can actually afford for, let's say, a slightly better pair, I actually think Petrovic plus Verbruggen works really, really well because the rotation is good, and ultimately you get to use Petrovic most of the time. But Verbruggen covers the bad fixtures for someone like Petrovic. So that's something that I would recommend for people who actually have a little bit more money to actually spend within FPL. In defense, though, I would go Gabriel and Timber. Now, this already, for example, already indicates that I'm going to go double Arsenal defense only. But I don't think it's wrong to, let's say, go triple Arsenal defense. I think, if anything, I think there have been other weeks in the past where I would probably have considered it. However, I still really like Saka within the short term. I think he's really good for captaincies, as I said, just to alternate with Haaland. So that's why I would prefer having Saka with my draft, knowing as well that he's actually fit, and that the only reason why he was, for example, playing reduced minutes last week was actually because he was sick, as opposed to anything else. Trufe is actually someone that I would actually go within this Bournemouth team. What's impressed me so far is, first of all, he's nailed. So when you compare it to, let's say, Diakite, that's a big difference in terms of what you can get. Senesi's also on so many price rises. If you haven't gotten Senesi so far, I probably would just actually go for Trufe right now. Now, I own Senesi with my own team, and I'm sure a lot of other FPL managers do own Senesi. So if you have, for example, a team value tied up in Senesi, I think feel free to just keep Senesi within your team. But Trufe is the player that I would actually go with at this moment in time if I wanted to use my budget up appropriately. At the same time, I think I wouldn't really target the Chelsea defense now because I still think that there's a propensity for probably Chalobah, Tosin, and even Akampong to actually just get benched within games now. And I wouldn't run that risk just for the two really, really good fixtures that Chelsea have coming out of Game Week 10. So what I would probably actually suggest is to go Munoz. This is basically your triple up in defense, right? You're going Gabriel, Timber, and Munoz. And then when the fixtures actually get a little bit better, you can even alternate between sort of playing a back four with Trufe. Whereas in the meantime, you just play Gabriel, Timber, and Munoz. I would also actually put Anderson within the team. Now, if you feel like Anderson's actually has a long-term injury, based on the sort of update from Marco Silva, and that, for example, Anderson's not going to come back in the short term, I can understand wanting to sort of move off of someone like Anderson. I totally get that. However, I think if Anderson's going to come back, for example, in Game Week 11, I think he's actually worth holding within the wild card because he's actually a really good defender. And I still prefer him to, let's say, some of the 4.1 defenders who've been really, really impressive so far. Now, this is mostly because this week, I think, is almost one of the last few weeks to actually go for a Sunderland defense and actually get really good value from someone like Mukiele. At the same time, when I look at someone like Rodon, Leeds have been super impressive so far, and so is Sunderland, to be honest, in terms of underlying stats. But the key thing is just the fixture run, and I think both of these players are not necessarily as playable as Anderson maybe going forwards. Clearly, you can disagree. As I said, you'd probably go Rodon if you weren't going to play Mukiele this week, and I don't think you will. And if you, let's say, just want the player who's performed the best so far, I mean, which is Mukiele, I can understand that too. In the midfield, I would actually go with a pretty similar structure to what I've suggested in previous videos. The big difference here, I think, is sort of almost the advent of the Man United midfielder coming back, because Man United have started to impress us a lot more as a team and just seem so much more consistent. I think the biggest thing with United is, can they go away versus some teams in the Premier League and actually put performances that are good away from home outside of that sort of one-off game versus Liverpool? If anything, there probably is an asterisk against playing versus Liverpool now because they just seem to be such a poor side and really struggling versus almost any Premier League team that they face. Whereas obviously a team like United this season, their performances have mostly been sort of marred by really poor away performances, but then actually just been being a fantastic team at home at Old Trafford, where their underlying stats, especially when you look at NPXG, puts them top 3 in the league as an attack. So I think getting access towards someone like Mbeumo just makes a lot of sense. And of course, he is now, I think, the leader within the league in NPXGI for the midfielders. So no surprise to find him here. Now, I still personally prefer Bruno towards Mbeumo, and I'm sure a lot of people would sort of completely shrug at that, and I get that, and that's fine. I would go Mbeumo just purely from a price point basis. If you're just going to pick one out of the two, if you're trying to create the most well-rounded team possible, I would always welcome someone going from Bruno to Mbeumo just to actually allow them to get the team structure that they want. However, if you can afford Bruno, once again, go for Bruno. I would probably still back someone who's on penalties, who actually, if you look back at even, let's say, the Brighton game, which is Mbeumo's best game so far, had, I think, equal or similar opportunities to actually get goals, especially when you take into account that there could have been a penalty for Man United. Minte is someone who I think is an absolute lock in this draft. I think he's just a little bit underpriced. For me, he actually has the value of a 6.5 midfielder, given that he's absolutely nailed for this Brighton team, that Brighton actually have a good run of games themselves. And also, just to top all this off, I mean, he's a set piece taker, so has the chance to be a bonus magnet for this team, and is just someone who's actually fit, right? Compared to someone like Matoma or Welbeck, who's had serious sort of ailing injury issues from time to time and season to season, the big difference here when you look at someone like Minte is that I feel like you can almost trust that he should be fit for most of the season, and he's a young player, someone who's also developing as well, and just has looked really good so far. For example, the performance versus United wasn't 100% complete, but I mean, in terms of how dangerous he was, drawing that penalty, for example, being able to be the last man in a lot of circumstances and actually creating chances, I think is the key thing that Minte has been able to do. He's even had better underlying stats than, for example, his Pierre and Mitoma, despite Mitoma actually missing the last few games. As far as, let's say, Sarr and Enzo, I think they're just locks. These are players that I've actually featured on a lot of draft wildcards recently. Now, they haven't really actually delivered so much, but I think the underlying stats for the season within the midfielders already suggest that Sarr and Enzo are probably a little bit underpriced within the current context, right? The context being that Sarr, before AFCON, just has a simply astoundingly good run of games. The context for Enzo being where Palmer is out of the game, Enzo should be on penalties and should be one of the best picks in the game. He himself, without the penalties, when you look at non-penalty numbers, has already racked up a lot of big chances. Now, he is not someone who's a bit of a volume shot taker like a Garnacho. He is someone who actually just arrives to the right positions at the right times. Even sometimes, for example, just getting a header within the box and getting a tap in there, or just getting a big chance in terms of actually being able to get shots off from key positions inside and outside of the box. Saka is the player that I'm going with here, simply because we are backing this sort of double Arsenal setup in defense and also going a little bit cheaper within the goalkeepers. The reason, as I said, that I want to approach this structure and why I like this structure, generally speaking, is because I do think that you're going to be looking at the future weeks where, for example, let's say if Holland is versus a team like Newcastle away, this is an opportunity to look for a vice captain, and you need a vice captain in place. And I think the vice captain that I would take in most circumstances in the weeks where, let's say, City don't have great games would actually be Bukayo Saka, who actually lines up really, really well. So when I think about, let's say, rotating the kind of captaincies over the next few weeks, I would say, for example, game week 10 is probably going to be something like a Holland captaincy. But if we look ahead towards the next 6 game weeks as an example, the way that I would probably approach it is by going for, let's say, Holland in 10, Holland in 11, Saka in 12, Holland in 13, and then Saka again on 14, but maybe you can actually just go for the United midfielder in this case, and then back to Holland, for example, and then actually back to Saka in game week 16. So actually, when we look ahead towards, let's say, the next 6 game weeks or 6-7 game weeks before the AFCON transfers roll around, I do think that there's enough value there to actually get an Arsenal player within your team that is an attacker that can also provide good captaincy value. At the same time, I can see a lot of people just liking Gabriel as a captaincy. I think that there's a lot of value in that, but I would still trust that, let's say, Arsenal will be able to score enough goals where it's not always going to be the case that Arsenal has a defender, for example, being the absolute top in terms of points. I think someone like Saka can easily creep up to having huge hauls going forwards. And that's just my reflection in terms of just knowing the value of someone like Saka as a player. But of course, this season so far, we've seen mostly just defensive mids and mostly center backs, to be honest, benefiting from set pieces. And that's sort of been the tail of the tape of the season. Maybe I'm actually being a bit biased to, let's say, what players have done in the past, but I'm almost hoping that the Premier League will allow for more open play goals and that some of the more dominant attackers within the league, the more premium attackers, will finally get some value or produce some value at least. So that's kind of my thoughts as to why I would go with Saka. In the front line, just to round things off, I'm actually going to go and suggest just going for Mark Yu at 4.2. If you, for whatever reason, don't want to block yourself from Chelsea and don't want to use a transfer in Yu, I guess you can always go Obi with United. If you really want a chance like Krupi in the future for whatever reason, I probably wouldn't do it because I think the value of Krupi really was just simply playing Krupi last week in a Nottingham Forest at home game, which was a really good game on paper. I can't say that his minutes are absolutely guaranteed or can vouch for him being a very good pick if he was only going to play, let's say, 60 minutes per match, or even come off the bench and actually just play 30 minutes. So for me, I don't think I would actually sacrifice a little bit more money in the bank to go for Krupi. As I said, unless you have some value tied up and you really are fond of Krupi a little bit more than myself, for example, and you have a bit more confidence that he's going to maintain the minutes even if Evan Nilsson comes back to this Bournemouth team, who ultimately still have two poor fixtures. I also wanted to address the point in terms of Bournemouth here because, of course, you can see that this draft doesn't have Semenyo. For me, the value I think of doing a wild card now is assuming that you actually have free transfers saved up, and I think most people will do. Right? It's not so often nowadays that you're going to dead end into a wild card. I think if you've held onto the wild card this late, you most probably actually have a couple of free transfers rolled up. Unlike myself, for example, in game week 4, when I was actually forced to wild card simply because I had so many injuries stacked up in one game week and long term almost injuries at the time. In this case, I think if you have transfers rolled up, the whole point really is to almost benefit from, let's say, a short term structure here where you actually go with some of the more better midfielders with better fixtures who are a bit cheaper than Semenyo. And then you can revert back into moving into Semenyo as soon as game week 12 rolls around when the Bournemouth fixtures start up again. And here, I think in this case, 10 and 11 are poor fixtures, even for Liverpool and Bournemouth, who just have, I believe, City and Aston Villa. So that's kind of how I would view things at this moment in time. I think Semenyo is someone who a lot of people think is absolutely going to be nailed within a draft. But I think part of the value of going for a Game Week 10 draft wildcard here is you're trying to target the fixtures. You want to have a different team. You've deliberately delayed the wildcard to have slightly different teams with other managers. And I think this is an opportunity to differentiate, at least for 2 weeks' time, and benefit from what are poor Semenyo games. He hasn't really racked up really good underlying stats as of late. Sure, of course, he's overperformed them so far this season, but there's nothing to say that he's going to continue to overperform them at the same rate, and specifically in the very, very tough fixtures where he's going to struggle to get chances himself. So that's kind of why I do think sidestepping Semenyo can make sense and should make sense on the wild card. This is the whole point of taking the opportunity here. I would then round off the team with the very template Mateta and Haaland. I think it's very hard to shy away from this, especially with the Nketiah injury. The Nketiah injury seems like a reoccurrence of his hamstring injury which he suffered earlier in the season and kept him out for, I think, at least 4 to 5 or 6 game weeks at a time. So yeah, that's kind of the context for me that means that, let's say, someone like Mateta is absolutely locked within the draft. I don't think Waltemad really competes against, let's say, someone like Mateta, just because he's not someone who's like a 100% penalty taker. Neither does he have the same sort of level of chances that Mateta is getting per match, or even the same quality of fixture run. With João Pedro, I think we're seeing just absolutely nothing in terms of open play so far. And not much from this Chelsea team that really suggests that things will change, radically speaking, for this team going forwards. If anything, as I said, the key thing with Enzo is that he's actually racking up these non-penalty underlying stats. João Pedro is not. João Pedro has already overperformed in terms of how he was able to get his points this season, where someone like Enzo, I think, has proven that he's actually getting the underlying stats that suggests that he probably will continue to perform quite well, especially with good Chelsea games in hand. I'm not dismissing that João Pedro can get points in the future or that Waltemad will do well, just that I think if I was to, let's say, go with a structure like this, 3-5-2, I think I would still just back Mateta very easily. And then Haaland is just a lock just because of the context of the game where Salah just isn't competing or competitive. Neither is Liverpool really as a team. And at the same time, Haaland has still been able to rack up some of the best underlying stats and actually just has overall produced a much better season in terms of underlying stats compared to, let's say, last year where City were struggling. I still think City are struggling as a team and probably not as dominant as they've ever looked, for example, let's say 2-3 years ago. But the key thing is that Haaland's numbers and City's ability to sort of create chances for Haaland is still very much evident this season and has been much more pronounced. So I would just go with Haaland here and, forget about, I think, even, let's say, the need to maybe move towards Salah in Game Week 12. I just don't think that that's something that a lot of managers will actually need to do, despite Liverpool's fixture run getting much better starting from Game Week 12. If anything, I think there's more of a consideration for going for players like Foden or even players like Szoboszlai in 2-3 game weeks time where the fixture run is better for a team like Liverpool or better for a team like City. And maybe we have a bit more faith in a team like City and their ability to sort of utilize Foden this season because they just simply haven't been. So that's going to be the wildcard for this week. As I said, there's a couple tweaks that you can all implement as managers, situations where you can probably spend a little bit more money on certain players, situations where you can spend a little bit less money on certain players. But that's pretty much how I would go about the Game Week 10 wildcard. I wish you guys the best of luck. See you guys soon, and take care.